What if Jesus met Jeffrey Epstein? In a corner of the world, scrubbed clean by sun and sea, a private paradise was built. It was an island sanctuary, a monument of glass and stone designed to look like a temple, but built to function as a tomb for innocence. Here, priceless art hung on walls that absorbed secrets, and the very air was thick with the scent of extreme wealth and an even more extreme moral decay. This was not just a home, it was a throne room, the heart of a hidden kingdom meticulously crafted to serve one man's insatiable appetites. It was a place where beauty was used as a mask for the grotesque, and the sound of the ocean was a constant, deliberate tool to drown out the silent screams of the souls trapped within its gilded cage. At the center of this universe sat its creator, a modern king who ruled not a nation, but a web of influence and desire. He was the merchant of souls, a predator who saw the world as a transactional marketplace. In his mind, every person had a price, every desire was legitimate, and every law was negotiable for those with enough power. He moved with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed he was intellectually and morally superior, operating on a plane far beyond the judgment of common men. His philosophy was etched into the island's very foundation, that the strong are not only permitted, but are entitled to consume the weak, and that innocence is not a thing to be protected, but a commodity to be acquired. Then, without a sound, without a ship disturbing the turquoise water, a presence appeared. On the pristine white sand, standing before the temple of depravity, was Jesus. He was not there as a guest or an intruder. He was simply there, an absolute and undeniable reality in a world built on illusion. His arrival was a silent tear in the fabric of this controlled environment. The harsh, brilliant sunlight, once a tool to create a facade of paradise, now seemed to pass through him, casting a light that did not just illuminate, but exposed every shadow, every stain, every hidden corner. The heavy air, once choked with secrets, suddenly became still and clear, charged with an unspoken and unbearable truth. The master of the island, a man used to controlling every variable, was confronted with a force he could not calculate, manipulate, or purchase. His usual tools, a dismissive smile, a condescending gesture, an offer of luxury, were rendered useless, evaporating against the silent, unwavering gaze. The tension was not in what was said, but in what was seen. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world, to build an island of pleasure, and forfeit his very soul? The shepherd stood before the wolf, and the battle for eternity began in the silence. If this encounter already makes you think, then subscribe now to this channel, because here the power of heaven confronts the thrones of the earth. The merchant of souls observed this silent man on his shore, not with fear, but with the cold, detached curiosity of a collector examining an unidentifiable artifact. In his mind, the world was a complex machine of levers and gears, and people were merely components to be manipulated. He had built his kingdom on this principle, a fortress of influence cemented by the weaknesses of others. He stood on the balcony of his temple, a modern-day king looking down, convinced that his intellect and immense wealth were impenetrable shields. He believed he was the architect of his own reality, a master of a universe where every soul had a price tag, and he was always the highest, most patient bidder. This conviction ran deeper than mere arrogance. It was the central doctrine of his self-made religion. The narrative he preached to himself was that he was not a sinner, but a superior form of man, operating on a plane beyond the primitive moralities of the masses. He genuinely saw himself as an enlightened being, a connoisseur of human nature who simply understood the world's transactional heart, the rules of society, the laws of nations, the cries of the weak. These were constructs for lesser men, chains he had long since transcended. His island was not a hideaway from judgment, but a monument to his liberation from it, a world remade where his will was the only law that truly mattered. And at the heart of this twisted gospel was its most profane tenet, the belief that innocence was a commodity. For the merchant of souls, vulnerability was not a state to be protected, but a resource to be harvested. He saw the purity of the young not as sacred, but as the most valuable currency in his dark and hidden marketplace. In his own distorted view, he was not a destroyer, but a gatekeeper to experience, offering what others were too timid to even imagine. But standing before him now was the living embodiment of a different, eternal law, a silent, terrifying decree that it would be better for a man to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and be drowned in the sea than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. The confrontation of these two realities was absolute, yet it unfolded in the deafening quiet. The merchant's entire empire was built on shadows and secrets, a world where darkness was his most useful tool. Jesus, however, was pure, unfiltered light. His very presence was a divine declaration that nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Every self-serving justification, every intellectual argument for his own supremacy, every carefully constructed rationalization for his cruelty began to feel hollow and pathetic under that unwavering gaze. The shepherd's truth did not need to be spoken to be heard, it simply was, and in its presence the wolf's kingdom of lies began to feel like a fragile house of cards. For the first time in decades, a flicker of something other than calculated superiority crossed the merchant's face. It was not remorse. It was the cold, sharp, and deeply unsettling shock of being truly seen. All his life, he had been the observer, the one who analyzed, categorized, and controlled others from a position of power. Now, he was the one being examined. His soul laid bare without a single word being uttered. The power dynamic had been completely and irrevocably inverted. Comment here, what do you think he saw in the eyes of Jesus? The silent man on the beach held no weapon, yet he wielded a truth that threatened to bring the merchant's entire world crashing down from within. The fortress of the mind, the merchant's most trusted sanctuary, began to fail him. He tried to file the man on the beach away, to label him as a hallucination born of sun and isolation, a trick of the light. He marshaled his intellect, the sharp, cold instrument that had dissected and dominated everyone he had ever met, but it found no purchase here. This presence was not an idea to be deconstructed or a weakness to be exploited. It was a fact, as solid and immovable as the bedrock beneath his island. The silent figure on the sand was a mirror, and for the first time the merchant of souls saw a reflection he could neither manipulate nor shatter. His ego, an empire built on the illusion of control, began to feel the first seismic tremors of an existential threat. The silence that radiated from the shepherd was not peaceful. It was an active, hollowing force. It was the sound of truth itself, and it was deafening. The merchant's entire world was built on noise, the hum of private jets, the murmur of secret deals, the shallow laughter of the complicit, the carefully orchestrated distractions that drowned out the cries of the soul. But in this absolute quiet, every lie he had ever told himself began to scream. His self-made religion, with its doctrines of entitlement and its gospel of appetite, had no defense against this purity. The light from the shore was unbearable, precisely because it demanded nothing, yet exposed everything. For this is the verdict. The light has come into the world, but men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. He recoiled, not physically, but spiritually. He retreated into the rotten core of his own philosophy, desperately clinging to the belief that he was the master of his own universe. He had written his own commandments, chief among them being that power was its own justification, and that the desires of the strong were the only law that mattered. He was a god on this island, a creator of a reality where his will was absolute. But the kingdom he had built on the sand of human suffering was now confronted by the unshakable rock of the kingdom of God. And in that silent confrontation, his throne of glass and stone began to look like what it truly was, a monument to a dead and empty soul. The judgment was not a thunderclap from heaven. It was a whisper carried on the sea breeze, a thought that felt as if it had been planted in his own mind. Suddenly the very air seemed to vibrate with a terrifying, immutable law, that nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Every locked door on his island, every secret chamber, every buried memory felt as if it were being laid open under the sun. The priceless art on his walls seemed to transform, their painted eyes no longer observing but accusing. The weight of every secret he had ever kept pressed down on him, suffocating him in the open air of his own paradise. If this spiritual confrontation is already shaking you, share this with someone who needs to see it. He was being stripped bare, not of his clothes or his wealth, but of his justifications. The silent man on the beach was a divine auditor, and every line item in the merchant's soul was being marked in red. There was no argument, no debate, no trial, only a seeing. He was seen for exactly what he was, a predator who hated the light, a wolf who had dressed himself in the clothes of a king, a man who had feasted on innocence and called it sophistication. The judgment was complete, delivered in the crushing, unbearable silence. It was the terrifying realization that his soul had been weighed on the eternal scales and had been found wanting. There was no escape from this verdict, because it was a truth he now carried inside himself. The man on the shore became a spiritual mirror, and what it reflected was not a simple image, but a verdict. The merchant of souls, a man who prided himself on his ability to see through others, was now forced to see into himself. And the image staring back was a grotesque distortion of the God he imagined himself to be. Every principle he had lived by, that power justifies itself, that desire is the highest law, that the weak exist for the strong, was now held up against an absolute silent standard. His intellectual armor, forged in the fires of arrogance and cynicism, offered no protection. The light from the shepherd didn't attack, it simply revealed the rot beneath the polished steel. He tried to fight back, not with words, but with the full force of his internal philosophy. He was a product of a brutal world, he reasoned. He was not a monster, he was an evolution. He had simply mastered the game that others were too naive or weak to play. In his mind, he was a necessary force, a reflection of the world's true transactional nature. He told himself that he was providing what the world secretly craved, that he was merely a facilitator of its hidden appetites. This was not a justification built on guilt, but a worldview built on a profound and unshakable sense of superiority. He believed he was right, that his island was a logical conclusion for a man of his stature. But the mirror did not reflect his logic. It reflected his origin. It showed him that his true father was the first lie, and that his will was only to do his father's desires. The image staring back was that of a murderer from the beginning, not of bodies, but of innocence and truth. There was no truth in him. This spiritual diagnosis, delivered without a sound, bypassed his intellect and struck directly at his essence. The reflection was not of a powerful king, but of a hollow vessel filled with the desires of the abyss. The sophistication he cultivated, the intellectual superiority he claimed, it all dissolved into the simple, ugly portrait of a predator. The memories began to surface, unbidden and sharp. Not just the acts themselves, but the words he used to frame them, the web of deceit he spun for his victims, and most importantly, for himself. He saw himself promising opportunity while plotting consumption. He heard his own voice, smooth and reassuring, speaking lies as if they were gospel. Each rationalization, each self-serving argument that had once seemed so brilliant, now appeared as what it was, a flimsy shield to hide a soul that loved the darkness. The light from the shore was a fire, burning away the fog of his self-deception and leaving only the stark, undeniable truth of his evil. The merchant of souls was trapped, forced to stare at the monster in the mirror, a monster he had meticulously built and worshipped for decades. The silence from the shore was the sound of his own soul screaming in recognition. There was nowhere to run, for the judgment was not coming from the outside. It was blooming from within, a truth he could no longer deny. He was being seen, truly and completely, and the sight was unbearable. And you? Would you have the courage to look inside if you were in front of Jesus? Comment below. The invisible climax was not a storm, but a quiet, internal shattering. The merchant of souls, cornered by a silence more accusatory than any shout, desperately rallied his defenses. He was a product of a world that worshipped power, he told himself. He was not a monster. He was simply a more honest player in a game of predators and prey. His island, his wealth, his influence, these were not sins, but trophies, proof that he had mastered the system that others were too weak or hypocritical to even acknowledge. He believed he was an architect of reality, providing a service for the hidden desires that secretly governed the world. His actions were not evil. They were the logical, inevitable outcome of his own superiority. But the shepherd's presence was a divine solvent, dissolving the very foundations of this logic. Suddenly, the merchant's justifications felt thin, like brittle parchment held against a fire. The climax arrived not as a vision of hell, but as a single searing memory forced into the light. He saw a face, just one among countless, and for the first time he did not see a conquest or a commodity. He saw a soul. He felt the cold terror of a trust betrayed, the silent scream of an innocence being irrevocably broken. It was a truth that bypassed his intellect entirely. He had always believed he was the author of his desires, but now he saw them for what they were, the will of a father who was a murderer from the beginning. This was the true horror, the unbearable revelation. He was forced to see himself not as a god, but through the eyes of a little one. He felt their hope curdle into fear, their future shrink into a single suffocating moment of violation. The opulent room around him seemed to warp, the priceless art on the walls twisting into accusing visages. The luxurious comfort of his temple became a mockery, the very air thick with the ghosts of stolen childhoods. This was not a punishment being inflicted upon him. It was the simple, unvarnished truth of his existence being laid bare. It was the terrifying, eternal weight of a millstone he had placed around his own neck. Faced with this absolute reflection of his own evil, he did not break in repentance. He recoiled in pure, narcissistic rage. To accept this vision would be to accept that he was not a master, but a monster. Not a king, but a slave to the very darkness he thought he controlled. The horror came not from guilt, but from the complete annihilation of his self-made godhood. He turned away from the light, not because he couldn't see it, but because he hated what it showed him. He chose the darkness because his deeds were evil. And you? Would you have the courage to look inside if you were standing before Jesus? Comment below. The shepherd did not move. He did not need to. The climax was over, the battle for this soul lost not by force, but by choice. The merchant had been offered a look into the heart of truth and had slammed the door shut. But the image was now burned into his mind, a permanent ghost in his machine. The silence on the island was no longer a sign of his control. It was the sound of his own damnation echoing back at him. The judgment had been delivered not by a divine decree, but by the man himself. He had seen the light, understood the darkness, and made his choice. His paradise was now officially a tomb, and he was its first and only permanent resident. The shepherd was gone, but the silence he left behind was no longer empty. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven with the threads of an unspoken verdict. The merchant of souls stood alone on his balcony, the warm sea breeze now feeling like a cold, accusing whisper. He tried to reclaim his throne, to reassemble the shattered pieces of his god complex. He told himself it was a hallucination, a stress-induced phantom born of his own magnificent isolation. He was the king of this domain, the master of reality, but the image of his own soul, reflected back at him in that silent gaze, was now a permanent stain on his consciousness, a truth he could never again unknow. He fought back internally, marshalling the full force of his philosophy. The world, he argued to the ghosts in the air, is a jungle. Power is the only real law. He was not a sinner. He was a survivor, an apex predator who had simply refused to be prey. He had built this empire not on evil, but on a clearer understanding of human nature, its appetites, its weaknesses, its transactional heart. He was providing a service, fulfilling the secret desires that govern the world of the powerful. This was not a confession, it was a defiant creed, a desperate attempt to reaffirm the twisted gospel that had guided his entire life and justified every transgression. But the words felt like ash in his mind. The spiritual physics of his island had been permanently altered. A new law had been etched into the very stone of his temple, a question that echoed in the crashing waves. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? The priceless art on his walls, once symbols of his taste and power, now seemed like tombstones marking the death of his humanity. Each luxury was a monument to his spiritual bankruptcy. His paradise, once a fortress of indulgence, had been transformed into the grand, opulent ledger of his damnation, with every asset accounted for as a liability against his soul. The light of the encounter, though gone, continued to shine inward, illuminating the dark archives of his memory. He saw faces, heard his own voice making promises that were lies from the start, and felt the chilling hypocrisy between the man he presented to the world, the sophisticated host, the brilliant financier, and the hollowed-out thing he was in the secret chambers of his life. The shepherd had not spoken a word, yet his presence was a divine declaration that nothing is covered up that will not be revealed. The judgment was not a future threat, it was a present, ongoing reality, unfolding now within the inescapable prison of his own mind. He was left stranded, not on a physical island, but on the desolate rock of his own revealed nature. The encounter had not destroyed his wealth or his influence, it had annihilated his most precious creation, the illusion of his own righteousness. His armor was gone, leaving him naked and exposed to a truth he could neither fight nor flee. He was now eternally alone with the monster he had nurtured, forever haunted by the memory of the light that had forced him to see its face. And you? Would you have the courage to look inside if you were standing before Jesus? Comment below. The shepherd was gone, but the island was no longer a sanctuary of silence. It was a tomb resounding with it. The truth of the encounter lingered not as a memory, but as a permanent shift in the spiritual atmosphere. The merchant of souls stood alone, the architect of a paradise that had just been declared a wasteland. He had not been struck down by lightning or condemned by a thundering voice from the heavens. The judgment was far more intimate, far more terrifying. He had been given a single, unfiltered look at the truth of his own soul, and in a moment of pure, narcissistic horror, he had chosen the darkness over the light. The battle was over. The verdict was not delivered, it was sealed by his own hand. He scrambled to rebuild the fortress of his mind, desperately reasserting the doctrines of his self-made religion. He told himself it was an illusion, a phantom born of isolation and power. He was not a monster, he was a master of a brutal game, a reflection of the world's true transactional heart. He wasn't a destroyer, he was a facilitator, a provider of experiences the world secretly craved but publicly condemned. He argued to the ghosts in the air that his actions were not evil, but the logical extension of a world where the strong take and the weak are taken from. This was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a defiant roar of an ego refusing to die, a king clinging to a throne that had already crumbled to dust, But his arguments were hollow, echoing in a space now governed by a new, immutable law. The very air vibrated with a question that had become his eternal tormentor. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? The question wasn't an accusation. It was a spiritual balance sheet, and his entire life was the final damning entry. The priceless art, the architectural marvels, the sheer weight of his wealth, they were no longer trophies of his success. They were monuments to the price he paid, gilded tombstones marking the single, catastrophic loss of his own humanity. His kingdom of pleasure had become a museum of his spiritual bankruptcy, and he was its only visitor. He was now trapped, not by walls of stone, but by the walls of his own revealed character. The encounter had not stripped him of his riches, but of his righteousness, the one thing he had so carefully manufactured. He was left naked, exposed not to the world but to himself, forever haunted by the reflection he saw in that silent, unwavering gaze. The ultimate horror was not the evil he had done, but the fact that he was forced to see it, and he lacked the courage to do anything but turn away. He was now eternally alone with the monster he had so lovingly created. And you? Would you have the courage to look inside if you were standing before Jesus? Comment here below. The merchant of souls is not just one man. He is a symbol of a world that builds its own private islands to hide from God. It worships power, negotiates with evil, and believes that wealth can buy a pardon from the truth. But no paradise is remote enough, no secret is buried deep enough, and no soul is powerful enough to outrun the light. The reckoning always comes, not as a storm, but as a quiet, unbearable moment of seeing. While the world bows to thrones of influence and appetite, we choose to follow the unshakable truth. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next confrontation between heaven and earth.